So in this video, I'm going to be doing a ranking of all the different eras from Walt Disney Studios animation, the 7 distinct eras. I've done videos in the past where I've ranked all the Walt Disney Animated Studio films, the 60 something that there are now, but for Wish I want to do something different. Since it's celebrating the entire history of Disney, I felt like it's a fun opportunity to go back and look at the different eras of Walt Disney Studios animation films. What's great about these films is that there's so many of them, but you can categorize them into distinct eras. Much like how the Marvel Cinematic Universe has its phases, it almost works the same way for Walt Disney Studios animation. So the 7 distinct eras, I'm going to be going from worst to best, least favorite to my favorite, however you want to put it. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy. The Package Era, also known as the Wartime Era, was a series of 6 films from 1943 to 1949, after the initial films from Walt Disney Studios Animation. Because of budget reasons related to World War II, Disney was able to produce films that were sort of a package of stories stick together into package-type movies, hence the name Package Era. Most casual movie viewers, even Disney fans, won't know, seen, or have heard of most of the films from this era. The Three Caballeros has had a pretty good legacy because of its main heroes, and people mainly know Mr. Toad from the ride at Disneyland. The others, Saludos Amigos, Make Mine Music, Fun and Fancy Free, and Melody Time, most Disney fans will not have seen a frame of these films. Anytime I have a casual discussion about movies with the people I work at Disneyland and bring up something like Make Mine Music, they won't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Now, due to the package nature of the stories in these films, they just don't really work as modern day movies. At times they can feel pretty obnoxious, boring. In fact, I know I was pretty annoyed by most of them when I was watching them for the first time a few years ago. Now, there is some 40s cartoonish charm to parts of these films and some good segments and stories, like Willie the Whale, Pecos Bill, and definitely Mickey and the Beanstalk from Fun and Fancy Free. But if you've seen these films, you can definitely understand why this is Disney's forgotten era. The Dark Age encompassed Disney from 1970 to 1988. These were the films that followed and were produced after Walt Disney's death, and before the next distinct era of Disney filmmaking. It's called the Dark Age for a reason, because while I don't think any of the films in this era were actually bad, they're lacking in that familiar, you guessed it, Disney magic and whimsy. I'm excluding the first 3 films from this era from this distinction, Aristocats, Robin Hood, and The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. They all actually have an influence from Walt Disney himself in whimsy and fun to some degree. The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh actually being the best example of a package film. The majority of the films after that, though, feel quite dark and very non-Disney-like. That's for better and for worse. I very much appreciate actually the more mature story in The Fox and the Hound, or The Black Cauldron for being a fantasy film with as minimum whimsy and fun type elements as possible. But collectively together, this wasn't a fun era for Disney films, hence why the name The Dark Age was appropriate. From 2000 to 2008, Disney had what's known as the experimental era, also known as the Second Dark Age, and it had the misfortune of following the heights they reached with their previous era filmmaking. This is when Disney wasn't quite sure what it wanted to be like the previous era, and just started experimenting with various types of films, throwing shit against the wall with various degrees of success and failure. There was no template like some of the notable eras of Disney filmmaking. It started with Fantasia 2000 and Dinosaur. Fantasia 2000 being a very misguided attempt at trying to recreate the success of the first film, and Dinosaur being a film that just hasn't aged very well and is pretty visually ugly and has some of the most boring characters you'll ever see in a Disney film. But then many a Disney fan will tell you their affinity for the next series of films, and that was The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis the Lost Empire, Lilo and Stitch, and Treasure Planet. Lilo and Stitch was the only film of this era to have both critical and financial success, and we all see how popular the franchise is still to this day. The other films that I mentioned just there didn't do so great at the box office, some just outright bombs. But when you ask people what their favorite hidden gems from Walt Disney Animation Studios are, they will say Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, and Treasure Planet are definitely some of the more popular options. But the final half of this era, Yikes. I'm excluding Brother Bear from this. It's not great, but it's definitely not bad either. It's an okay film. But then they had consecutive years where Disney subjected audiences to the 1-2 punch of Home on the Range in 2004 and then Chicken Little in 2005. Home on the Range being essentially the film that killed 2D animation for Disney Studios, and Chicken Little being Disney's not-so-great first attempt at a 3D animated film. These two films belong at the bottom of anyone's Disney animation rankings list. They're that bad. The final two films, Meet the Robinsons and Bolt, ended up being pretty forgettable, ending an era that Disney was likely eager to get away from. During this time, Disney animation was really being carried by Pixar, as the second half of the experimental era was a pretty big disaster, if you ask me. Thankfully, though, the real creative slump of this era only lasted 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, so nothing too long, and then thankfully it was over.
Oh, okay.
Disney's Silver Age was from 1950 to 1967. It was Disney's return to making movies that we would call traditional movies following the package era of films from the 1940s. Now, I actually think the initial phase of these movies in the 1950s, that's Cinderella through Sleeping Beauty, are the epitome of pure Disney magic, old school or new school. For your classic fairy tale type stories, they don't get much more magical feeling and fanciful than Cinderella, Peter Pan, and Sleeping Beauty. Alice in Wonderland and Lady the Tramp aren't fairy tale type stories, but they do still have that 1950s Disney magic type feel, though I like Alice in Wonderland much more than Lady the Tramp. Now, the second half of this era in the 1960s doesn't quite feel as magical for me, mainly because of the change in animation style to that scratchy type animation. Just not really the biggest fan of that. But 101 Dalmatians is still a great movie, Sword in the Stone, not so much, and The Jungle Book is mostly a fun flick for its music. The Jungle Book ended up being the last Disney animation film to come out before Walt Disney passed away in 1967, hence why this was the end of the Silver Age. The Golden Age is the first films from Walt Disney Studios Animation, from 1937 to 1942. Starting with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, up to and including Bambi. These films established the kind of characters, sweet fantasy stories, and fairy tale type feel that most Disney films are known for. At times, they are a bit dated now in terms of modern day storytelling, but they still work on a pure fun and visual level. Despite these being the initial films, the artistry in these films is second to none. You watch the fluidity of movement in Snow White and Pinocchio, the wow factor behind watching Fantasia, and the lifelike animal movement animation in Bambi. It's just top notch. 4 out of 5 of these films are visual masterpieces. Dumbo is a bit more simplistic in style, but it works for the more lighthearted, cartoonish nature of the story. Lighthearted being the key word here, because these films are notable for having moments where they got pretty dark and f***ed up for a kids film, let alone a Disney kids film.
Bring back her heart in this.
I guess kids were just a lot more badass back in the day.
He's almost here. I can't stand it any longer.
The dictionary defines revival as an instance of something becoming popular, active, or important again. The Disney revival ended up being appropriately named because following things not going so great with the previous era, the experimental era, Disney looked to rebound starting in 2009, doing what they do best, a princess story, with The Princess and the Frog. a 2D animated film that harkened back to the excellence found from their films in the 1990s. After that, though, Disney started doing a true new age of classic 3D animated features that offered some great variety from audiences. You had some new age fantasy musical princess type stories with Tangled and Frozen, non-musical highly entertaining features with Wreck-It Ralph, Big Hero 6 and Zootopia, and some sort of new age action adventure princess stories with Moana and Raya and the Last Dragon. Encanto doesn't really fit into any of these categories. It's a musical, but a non-princess story. But it was definitely beloved by all audiences. Definitely one of the most popular Disney movies going on right now. There were 3 sequels produced during this era. Ralph Breaks the Internet and Frozen 2 were sequels to their hit films, though neither got quite the same glowing reception their first films got. Ralph Breaks the Internet, I believe, gets a little bit of unfair hate, though Frozen 2, I believe, is much inferior to its predecessor in more than one way. The real odd duck of this entire era was that Winnie the Pooh movie from 2011, which technically is their last 2D animated film, though many would really consider The Princess and the Frog to be that. That Winnie the Pooh movie is short and sweet for what it is, but really, given the nature of that film, doesn't really have any business being a traditional Walt Disney Studios animated film. All of the films in this era, excluding the 3 sequels, were beloved, joining the ranks as classic Disney features. I do believe, though, this era ended with Encanto. Following Encanto, they released Strange World in 2022, which was a bomb both with audiences and financially. And then they released Wish recently, which, though it harkened back to classic Disney princess type stories, different animation style tribute to 2D and 3D animation, the movie just didn't really hit it with critics, not doing very well at all when you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score. And box office wise, after its opening weekend, definitely didn't do great at all. So with that, I kind of feel like the revival era ended with Encanto, and then now we're currently in a new era of Disney filmmaking. We'll see what that ends up being called. But as for now, the revival era, the previous era that we just experienced, was definitely an excellent era where Disney got back on track with classic new films. 4 films from this era won the Oscar for Best Animated Film that year. Raya and Moana didn't win because they came out the same years of Encanto and Zootopia respectively. So that goes to show how great this era was for Disney. It's definitely an era they're probably pretty thankful for.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The dictionary defines Renaissance as the revival of art and literature under the influence of classical models in the 14th and 16th century. The Disney Renaissance is appropriately named, as it was Disney's return to making what's regarded as classics, using the initial template of stories and characters from their old-school heyday films, but applying new age filmmaking, storytelling, and characters to make a mostly incredible series of films from 1989 to 1999. The Little Mermaid started this in 1989, came out and wowed audiences. Took a fairy tale type story, added a new age Disney touch to it, had the first Disney princess in 30 years, that'd be crazy to think about now, and had the sidekicks, villain, and was a musical. But this was all done again with updated characters, storytelling, and pacing different from the films of the earlier Disney era. I'm excluding after this The Rescuers Down Under, that was more of an art experiment type film. But the rest of the films after this followed the same kind of format, taking familiar stories from a variety of sources, fairy tales, classic stories, Greek mythology, etc., and applied the same template of excellent filmmaking done in The Little Mermaid. Again, excluding The Rescuers, they then had a 4-film stretch that included The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. I mean, wow, that's just a peak 4-film stretch right there. I don't think it gets any better than having those 4 films released back to back to back to back like that. The only thing that can rival that is the films from the revival era, when they had a stretch of releasing the films Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Big Hero 6, Zootopia, and Moana consecutively. The second half of this era was nothing to sneeze at either. It started with Pocahontas, which is definitely the weakest non-Rescuers film of this era. But then they had The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan, and Tarzan, all fantastic in one way or the other. This era actually ended with Tarzan in 1999, ending a decade of excellence and peak Disney, and in my opinion, their best era of filmmaking for their traditional animated films.
Made you look.
So there you have it with my ranking of all the films from Walt Disney Animation Studios. As a lover of all things Disney history, some might call me a historian, this was a fun project to do. Just because when you look at the vast history of Disney films, it's fun to see how you can actually categorize them into distinct eras. As I mentioned, I think we're kind of in a new era now, starting with Strange World. We'll see what name that ends up taking on. But say what you will about Wish, and you can say a lot based on the reception it's gotten. It was a nice tribute to the history of Walt Disney Studios animation, appropriate on the company's 100-year anniversary. So that'll do it for this ranking video of the eras of Walt Disney Animation Studios. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching.